The Northwest Territories has some of the last pristine wilderness on Earth, but even here, hazardous waste poses a threat. Community governments are responsible for making sure that hazardous waste from residents in the community is handled safely and in line with rules designed to protect the environment and the health of the community. The first part of this video will help you, as a municipal or community government staff member, to learn the basics of handling and storing hazardous waste so that it can be safely managed and in some cases shipped out of your community. In the second part of this video, we're going to look at how your community government can control the buildup of hazardous waste by developing and implementing a hazardous waste management plan. Hazardous waste is waste that can be harmful to people and to the environment. The most common types of hazardous waste found in municipal disposal facilities are asbestos, lead-acid batteries from vehicles, glycol, other antifreeze and heating fluid, soil, snow, or water contaminated with fuel or oil, mercury-contaminated materials like thermostats and fluorescent lights, oil debris, old fuel, ozone-depleting substances like the gases in refrigerators or air conditioners, paint, propane tanks, fuel tanks and drums with oil residue in them, used oil, and vehicles that still have batteries, fluids, or mercury switches inside. Substances like mercury and used oil are highly toxic and are especially dangerous because they can seep into lakes and rivers and contaminate the water we use. To give you an idea of the impact hazardous waste can have, just 1 liter of used oil could contaminate 1 million liters of drinking water. Mercury found in fluorescent light bulbs and thermostats can contaminate very large amounts of water. In fact, if we were to imagine that the mercury from one thermostat were to leak directly into drinking water, it could contaminate as much as 5 million liters. Other substances, like gases used in refrigerators and air conditioners, can damage the atmosphere if they are released. Community governments are responsible for helping residents to dispose of these things when they are no longer good to use. Hazardous waste is produced from various industrial and commercial activities, as well as from activities related to government-run institutions. The businesses and governments that run these operations are responsible for transporting their hazardous waste to registered receiving facilities. Unless the community government has developed plans and registered their facility, they cannot accept hazardous waste from business and government. Understanding what hazardous waste is, why it is dangerous, and how it can be managed safely at the community level is very important for the health of people in your community and for the environment.
I went to a water course and they were showing pictures of other communities that had stockpile of a whole bunch of drums, some leaking out, and they didn't know what to do with it. So when I came back, and I know we had some, so that's one of my first things I did is get them ready, get them out of here, because in the future, or it might end up stockpiling more, and before we know it, we might not know what to do with it, and it might cost us maybe more money for the community just to get rid of it. Well, it's important because your community, plus it never know, might be leaking into the ground, leaking into the environment, because up here we get a lot of spring and melting, different types of weather. So, plus it won't cost us more money just to send it out and get rid of it. And we're fortunate to have somebody come here to take it off our hands.
In many NWT communities, hazardous waste is built up in storage sites. The longer this waste is left in storage sites, the greater the chance that it will cause damage to the environment and expose the community government to liability. In this section, we're going to cover the basics of getting a disorganized stockpile of waste under control. This will allow you to ship old waste to a registered receiving facility and have an organized site where new waste can be safely accepted. The Government of the Northwest Territories Department of Environment and Natural Resources has guidelines available for dealing with hazardous waste. You can refer to these guidelines for advice on safe handling and storage of waste as you get started organizing your site. The guidelines are available on the Department of Environment and Natural Resources website, www.enr.gov.nt.ca. You can also find contact information there for further help and resources. Hazardous waste can be flammable, corrosive, toxic, or reactive, and can cause injury if it is not handled correctly. Training in Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, often called WHMIS, as well as the Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulations, called TDGR for short, are considered the bare minimum for workers dealing with hazardous waste. These courses will teach you about how to read labels describing hazardous substances and how to make labels of your own. You should not attempt to deal with a hazardous waste stockpile until you have taken this training. If you are employed by the Band Office or Hamlet Council to handle hazardous waste, they are responsible for providing this training. Courses are available online, but it is better if training can be given by someone who already has the certification and has experience working with hazardous waste. There are also companies that offer facilitated web-based WMIS and TDGR training. You can also contact your local or regional Aurora College Adult Education Coordinator, as TDGR and WMIS courses are often offered as continuing education. Staff at the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission are also able to offer advice on appropriate safety training. Remember, if you have any concerns about whether or not a task you have been assigned is safe, you can contact the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission for advice. Safety needs to be your first consideration. Much of the hazardous waste in a disorganized site will not be properly labeled and may be in rough condition. Unlabeled containers may be holding something harmful. Containers may be under pressure, so handle each container with extreme caution to avoid contact with the contents. Touching, swallowing, or breathing these substances can cause severe injury. Before you start organizing the stockpile, ensure that anyone handling the waste has the appropriate safety equipment. Your personal protective equipment should include latex or nitrile gloves under thick working gloves, protective eyewear such as glasses or full face masks, good footwear such as steel-toed boots, clothes that fully cover the body, arms, and legs. Also, have eye wash equipment nearby. You'll need to have certain equipment on hand to safely handle hazardous waste and to clean up any accidental spills. Non-sparking bung wrenches are needed for safely opening drums. Hand pumps and drum fitting funnels will also be necessary if you have to move liquids from one drum to another. Absorbent pads should be used to clean up spilled liquids. There are two basic types. White pads absorb oils including gas and diesel, but they don't absorb water. Gray pads are good for general use because they absorb both oil and water. You'll need a supply of empty containers and drums that are clean and in good condition, as well as plenty of strong pallets. You can also make use of United Nations regulated waste containment bags, commonly known as mega bags. These can all be used to safely store and transport the hazardous waste. Once you get started at your waste site, your first job will be to identify the waste and label it. It is important to identify the hazardous waste at your waste site so it can be accurately labeled and included in an inventory. Label the waste as soon as you know what it is. Mixing substances can be dangerous, and it is much more expensive to ship and dispose of unknown or mixed waste than it is a drum containing a single known and labeled substance. When working with drums, keep an eye out for labels or any faded markings that could indicate what is inside the drum. However, if the drum has been previously opened, an old label may be out of date. To identify the contents of an unlabeled drum, or to verify the accuracy of an old label, you will need to open the drum. Before you do this, you should carefully check the drum for any leaks and other damage. Gerald Enns is the hazardous waste specialist at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. He is going to demonstrate how to safely open an unlabeled drum and identify the contents.
It's one of the things you want to try and do if you can when you're working on drums. If you get somebody to help you, slip a absorbent pad underneath it. That way you'll capture any drips and spills. You can also keep the absorbent pad up there. And it's also important to remember when you're approaching a drum, look for any damage. The paint is wearing off on this one, but the drum appears to be in reasonably good condition. If you don't know the contents of the drum, pay attention to the direction of the wind and try and stay upwind. And start by opening the smallest bung on the drum with a non-sparking bung wrench. And if you start to hear some hissing, at that point just back off away from the drum until it stopped hissing. Then come back and slowly open the bung wrench, or open the bung. That way this will minimize any exposure to the contents of the drum inside. And so once you've got that one open and the drum is the drum's no longer under pressure, you can open the bigger bung. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sample the drum to see what's inside of it, and we'll use a sampling tube. If you don't have one of these or any way of sampling the full depth of the drum, you can get a stick or something to put it in there. Never smell the opening of a drum. You can see that this drum is not quite full, so we're going to put this in there to see what's inside. And so we put this part in and it fills up, and then this stopper goes in. You give it a second to settle, and you put the stopper in to plug the bottom and then lift it out. Put it in our container. So this drum has got some used oil and some glycol in it. Pour the contents of our sample jar back into the drum. And we'll use this one on in the next drum. It's important when you're closing these drums back out that you make sure that the drum seal is in good condition so that the drum doesn't fill up with more water. We'll pour a little bit out just to see what it is. And if it beads up, it's water. And if it's fuel, it'll soak in. So that looks like water. One of the differences between the white sorbent pads and the gray sorbent pads is that the gray sorbent pads soak up oil and water, and the white sorbent pads do not. Now that the drum is sealed up, we'll label the drum, and you can do it one of two ways. You can use a paint pen, or you can use some spray adhesive to make sure that the label will stick. What I'll do is I'll put the name of this drum on here, or the name of the contents. I'll make sure that that corresponds with the drum on my list. Adhesive is set up. I'll make sure the drum is labeled, and I can also put a mark it with a paint pen. The number on the drum corresponds with the number on your list in case the label comes off. So this drum is inventoried, and we'll just keep moving along over to the next set of drums.
It is much better to open drums outside where any gases that have built up will be able to safely disperse. Also, make sure that no one is smoking nearby and that there are no open flames. It may happen that you are unable to identify some waste that you suspect is hazardous. As much as possible, this situation should be avoided by immediately identifying and labeling waste as they are discarded. However, there are ways to identify waste later. Substances like used oil and glycol are easy to identify by their appearance. Glycol may have a unique color, often bright pink or green. If you think that a clear liquid might be old fuel, you can test it using one of the white absorbent pads we just talked about. If the liquid is absorbed by the pad, then it may be fuel. If not, then it is most likely contaminated water. If you are not sure about the contents of a drum, and you suspect that they may come from an industrial source, a sample of the contents can be taken and transported to a certified lab for testing. You can contact a hazardous waste specialist at Environment and Natural Resources for more information. Once you have identified hazardous waste, it will need to be labeled. The Transportation of Dangerous Goods and Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System training both teach you how to properly label containers of hazardous waste. Once identified and labeled, the waste can be separated and recorded in an inventory. Remember, identify it, label it, segregate it, record it. Once you've identified waste and labeled the container, the waste needs to be segregated in its own separate area of the waste site. For instance, landfills should have clearly separated and signed areas to store vehicle batteries, drums of used oil, old fuel, glycol and contaminated water, propane tanks, paint, fridges and freezers or anything with refrigerants, stored separately from other white metals, and other types of household hazardous waste such as pesticides, aerosols, and cleaners. Once you've decided on an area, make sure that it is clearly defined and use signs so that other people will know that this is where hazardous waste is being stored until it is transported out of the community. Store like with like. For instance, drums of used oil can be consolidated into a large plastic tote, or partially filled drums can be combined to make one full container. Consider having a single labeled drum or tote for each of the following liquid wastes: used oil, glycol, waste fuel, and contaminated water. It is important to keep these waste types separated. Never mix different waste liquids or unknown liquids together. Mixing hazardous liquids can cause violent chemical reactions that are immediately dangerous to life and health. As well as making sure that drums are clearly labeled, it's also important to make sure that the drum itself is in good condition and suitable for safe storage and transportation. Drums are not suitable for storage and transportation if they are rusty or corroded, dented or bulging at the top, sides, or bottom, leaking anywhere. Drums must have bungs that can tightly seal. This is often the missing factor, and it is a good idea to have a collection of bungs on hand. These bungs should still have their rubber lining to ensure that they seal properly. Drums should not be filled to the brim. Liquids can expand as temperatures change, which will damage the container and probably cause overflow or leaking. Only fill drums to about 80 or 90% full. Drums should be stored on pallets so that they are kept off the ground and relatively dry. Drums stored directly on the ground are more likely to corrode around their base. 4 drums can be grouped together on a single strong pallet, providing it's in good condition. Empty drums must be stored on their side. Empty drums stored upright will fill with water. This water will mix with any residue in the drum, and instead of having an empty drum on your hands, you will now have a drum full of contaminated water. Empty drums can eventually be flattened and disposed of as scrap metal. Vehicle batteries and sometimes industrial-sized batteries are often found in municipal landfills. If the batteries are in good condition, they can be placed on a pallet and covered with cardboard. Batteries can be stacked 3 levels high with a good strong layer of cardboard between each of the layers and on top of the highest layer. Once full and stacked 3 high, the whole package can be plastic wrapped. Remember that plastic wrap can loosen and fall off, so this last step should be done just prior to shipment. If you think batteries are leaking or are likely to leak, they should be stored in a plastic container or tote. In the future, when vehicles are brought to the landfill, the batteries should be removed and stored in the hazardous waste section. Vehicles contain other hazardous liquids like the fluids used in brake lines, power steering systems, and transmission systems. If you have the knowledge and capacity at your facility, you should drain these liquids and store them safely in a segregated section of your waste site before scrapping the vehicle. Vehicles also contain mercury switches and refrigerants that should be removed and safely stored. Mercury-containing items should be secured in a labeled plastic container that is certified, such as these provided by the Switch-Out program. Some household items such as thermostats and some fluorescent light bulbs also contain small amounts of mercury. Even very small amounts of mercury can be hazardous for the environment and highly toxic to humans through skin contact or from breathing in vapors. Propane tanks can be transported with gas as a flammable waste. Although it is possible to vent propane tanks, this requires a specific venting protocol and a staff member with appropriate certification. If you don't have a protocol in place and the proper training to vent tanks, tanks should be left with valves in and labeled as flammable gas. 100-liter propane tanks can be grouped on top of a strong wooden pallet if it is in good condition. Once the pallet is full, a second pallet can be placed on top as a lid so that the tanks can be banded and packaged together using banding. For 40-liter propane tanks, the approach is similar, but the tanks can be stacked 3 high with a pallet between each layer. For more information about propane handling and training requirements, see the Canadian Propane Association website at www.propane.ca. Paint can be segregated according to whether it is latex or oil-based. It is extremely important to keep an accurate record of hazardous materials stored at the disposal site. This must be done during the cleanup of a hazardous waste stockpile, and it is also a central part of a good hazardous waste management plan. You'll need to record what kind of waste you have and how much of it there is, as well as some information about the condition in which it is stored and the location you have chosen to segregate and store it. Hazardous waste that require special treatment will have to be transported out of your community to a registered hazardous waste receiving facility, and you won't be able to do this without an accurate inventory. The records you make of the waste can be given to contractors to get an estimate of the cost of safely removing and disposing of the waste. Each container or pallet of hazardous waste can be given a number, and beside the number, there should be all of the information that will be needed for labeling and transportation. This includes the shipping name of the substance, the UN number, the class, and the packing code. Other types of information that will need to be recorded are the number of containers of each hazardous waste type and the size of each container. All of this information is required on a hazardous waste shipping document, and the details can be found in the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Regulations or Hazardous Waste Guidelines developed by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Now you know the basics of dealing with your hazardous waste stockpile. Identify it, label it, segregate it, and record it. By the end of the cleanup process, your site will be ready to receive and store new waste from households in the community in line with the segregation system you've created. Once this is done, it is important to develop a hazardous waste management plan so that community work staff know how to safely handle hazardous waste in the future. In part 2 of this video series, we'll explore how to make one of these plans.
This is a waste management site. The new one that we were talking about, like to reconstruct the old one, because the other one, it wasn't really organized that well. What we wanted to do was to cover this whole thing up and have a fence that goes in between, where this side will be the dump side and this side will be the batteries, like for hazardous. We wanted to store it so that if it's stored and during winter road, it can be shipped out. It would be all piled up over here. So what we got people to do was we hired at least 3-4 people to sort it out. And whatever that was not supposed to be in the dump site would go to either the junkyard or separating them out to ship them out. It's really organized the way it is right now, and I'm also asking them that they should have a blueprint of what they have done before, like where they've started digging and putting garbage in, so that if they have a blueprint, then they would know how to go about covering it up and where to go next, instead of just dumping it anywhere and not have a plan with it, Because the community is so small that it's not every year we send out stuff. Maybe every couple of years or every 3 years, maybe we would have at least 3-4 of those 45-gallon or whatever barrel that old oil, those waste oil, would be shipped out to either Yellowknife or Bishop Cove. Everybody throws everything away. And if it's not organized, then it's just a waste and it's harming the environment, like all the plastic stuff that needs to be looked into too. And if it's not really organized, then it's also harming the environment. And we're not only looking at now, we have to look at for the future. We have to make sure that we don't ruin it for our kids.
We've looked at how to deal with the stockpile of hazardous waste. Now we're going to look at creating and implementing a plan that will prevent stockpiles of hazardous waste from accumulating in the future. A good management plan will benefit your community in several ways. It will reduce health risks associated with hazardous waste buildup. It will limit the financial and environmental liability of the community government. It will also provide clear direction to the public works staff and ensure that vital knowledge is available to new staff if experienced staff should leave. For your plan to be as practical as possible, you will need to draw on the knowledge of lots of different people in your community. Public works staff who operate and maintain the solid waste facility will need to be involved because they understand how the site operates on the ground, and they are the ones who will implement the plan once it is developed. The senior administrative officer or band manager, as well as other administrative and senior staff, should contribute to the planning process. The mayor, the chief, and council members will need to be prepared to approve and enforce the plan. Your community may have developed, or may be in the process of developing, a source water protection plan, or a solid waste facility operation and maintenance plan as required for a community water license. It is important that staff are aware of all of these plans to ensure protocols are consistent and that there is no duplication between plans. An important step in your planning process will be to identify which types of hazardous waste will be accepted into the facility and from whom the community will accept waste. Remember, residents need a place to dispose of their household hazardous waste, but businesses and government need to ensure their hazardous waste is managed at registered receiving facilities. Households or residents in the community will produce small amounts of hazardous waste simply as a result of day-to-day activity like vehicle maintenance and household renovation. Your hazardous waste management plan needs to allow for residents to dispose of their household hazardous waste properly and safely. The Government of the Northwest Territories Department of Environment and Natural Resources has produced a guide that outlines the most commonly encountered types of hazardous waste and directs residents to separate household hazardous waste from regular garbage. Go to www.enr.gov.nt.ca, select Publications, and search for hazardous waste. This is the segregation bin system at the Yellowknife landfill site. You might want to consider using a similar system, maybe on a smaller scale.
So about 2 years ago, the city of Yellowknife started to segregate household hazardous waste right adjacent to their salvage area and disposal area, where residents can come and directly drop off their household hazardous waste in one of these bins. Periodically, somebody has to come and do a quick inventory and check on the status of these containers. We can quickly go through them. One point of caution, they should be checked on a regular basis because residents often don't put materials in these bins in good condition. It's also important that when you're handling hazardous waste and chemicals, especially things like pesticides that are toxic, that you wear the appropriate personal protective equipment. Now try gloves, underworking gloves, as these gloves won't protect you. So a lot of caution has to be exercised when you're opening one of these so that you don't get hit with a waft of gas, and then make sure that it's not quite full and you can carry on. Same with these. Sometimes people put things in that don't belong. So aerosol cans, oils, glycols, and miscellaneous items is how they've got it segregated here. This is a bin of fertilizers and oxidizers. Oxidizers can be things like bleach, fertilizers, or other miscellaneous chemicals. A bin of pesticides. This is where you really got to be careful that things haven't been put in upside down and this thing isn't creating gases. So that seems like it's got room in it. And here we've got a bin of flammable liquids, and you'll find things like old fuel, solvents, paint thinners, possibly butane lighters, or any other kind of flammable liquids. It's important to pull certain things out that don't belong with different types of hazardous waste.
Using the ENR guidelines we mentioned as a reference, you can discuss every hazardous waste type that is going to be accepted at your landfill facility. For each type, you will need to consider the following questions. Can this hazardous waste be managed within the community, or does it require transportation and disposal outside the community? How do we manage this hazardous waste from residents? Can we manage this waste from businesses and government? How will it be safely collected? For example, does it require a special container? Is it a liquid waste that needs to be transferred to a larger container? Where will it be collected? How much space will be needed? Whose role will it be to identify, label, segregate, and record the hazardous waste? How much will be collected before it is prepared for shipment? There should be a threshold at which a decision is made to send a shipment of waste out to a registered receiving facility. Will you be transporting the material out by road or by barge? What signage and directions will instruct people what to do? Some materials, like asbestos, can be safely disposed of in your community landfill, but asbestos can only be handled with special training and certification. Newer used oil can sometimes be burned in a used oil burner, providing it is not contaminated. Other types of waste, like batteries and mercury-containing items, will have to be transported out to a registered receiving facility. Once you accept waste into your site, you become responsible for it and for the cost of dealing with it. Remember that community governments are not responsible for the waste produced by governments and business activity. This means that your community government does not have to accept hazardous waste from mining or exploration projects, construction projects run by contractors who are hired by industry or territorial or federal government institutions, or commercial operations. A community requires special plans, equipment, and licenses to accept waste from industry, business, and government. Once you've decided what waste you will accept, who you will accept it from, and how you will store it, your next step will be to figure out how you're going to put your plan into action. The way you will implement your plan will vary depending on the size of your community and how much hazardous waste is being generated. However, every community will have to decide how they are going to communicate the plan, how they are going to assign responsibilities to municipal staff, and what equipment they will need to manage hazardous waste at the site. Experience has shown that communication is the most important factor in making a hazardous waste management plan work. Businesses and government will need to know what is acceptable and unacceptable hazardous waste in your disposal facility. Residents will need to learn about what services are available to them and how the plan protects the well-being of the community. Staff will have to understand their role in making the plan work. Resources dedicated to communicating the plan early on will save resources needed to deal with hazardous waste later. What kind of outreach and awareness-raising activities can you do? You might consider putting up posters, holding an open meeting, or talking about the plan on the radio. Residents need to know what options are available to dispose of household hazardous waste within the community. In some cases, residents and businesses will have options available to them outside of the municipality's disposal site. For instance, other institutions or private enterprises occasionally offer solutions for some types of waste. The Department of Environment and Natural Resources has pamphlets available on their website that are aimed at raising public awareness about household hazardous waste. Your municipality may want to develop local pamphlets and distribute these to households. What sort of assistance is your community government going to provide to residents to dispose of their household hazardous waste? Consider organizing collection events once or twice a year that make disposing of hazardous waste easy for residents, and that focus on educating about the available options. Make sure residents know who to ask. It will be important to identify the businesses and government in your community that may generate hazardous waste and inform them of the types of hazardous waste the disposal facility will and will not accept and under which conditions. This can be done in person or through phone calls, letters, and signage. The businesses and government in your community have the potential to add significant liabilities to your disposal site if they are allowed to dispose of their hazardous waste unchecked. Businesses and government are required to transport their hazardous waste to registered receiving facilities, and all staff should be familiar with stating the community's position on whether to accept hazardous waste from businesses and government. Be prepared to say, "We are not registered to receive that hazardous waste." Whether or not your plan works will depend, in a big way, on your staff. Staff will need to have the time and the training to manage waste that arrives at the site, to make sure that the segregation system is being followed, and that the plan is working for residents in general. All public works staff will need to be familiar with the plan, and new staff will need to understand it as part of their training. Hands-on training on site will ensure that staff understand how to implement the plan. This can be done by explaining the plan in a meeting, providing paper copies, and informing staff of where the written plan is located. The plan will need to outline how much time staff will need to do things like public education, checking and sorting segregation bins, maintaining inventories, and dealing with unacceptable hazardous waste. It's important that staff members are comfortable with their responsibilities under the new plan. In part 1 of this video, we talked about certain equipment that is needed for safely organizing stockpiles of waste. Secure drums, strong pallets, plastic totes, drum fitting funnels, and so forth. These will all be useful for managing any new waste that you accept at your site. But there are a few other pieces of specialized storage equipment that you might need, depending on how much waste you have to deal with and how often you think you'll need to send waste out of the community. You may want to invest in clearly labeled bins for safe segregation and storage of different hazardous waste types. Purpose-built segregation bins can be purchased from specialist suppliers. Hazardous waste can also be segregated using materials that are readily available within the community. Mega bags are a cost-effective means of containing and shipping a variety of hazardous waste items such as aerosols and oil paint cans. It is important to remember that containers used for collection may not be suitable for transportation. Hazardous wastes that are dangerous goods need to be transported in UN-rated containers. Ensure you reference the Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulation. Hazardous waste stored on pallets or large bins may need to be moved occasionally, and therefore equipment time for loaders or trucks needs to be budgeted into your plan. Remember that the hazardous waste section of your site will need to be clearly separated from the rest of the site with clear signs. The community government will need to set aside some funds for the removal of hazardous waste with a registered carrier to a registered disposal site. This money will need to cover the cost of both transportation and disposal. You can perhaps estimate the amount of hazardous waste you'll send out each year or every 2 or 3 years. Contact a registered hazardous waste receiver for a disposal quote and get quotes from barge or trucking companies. This is where you'll really need your accurate hazardous waste inventory. In these videos, we've covered the basics of safely organizing a stockpile of hazardous waste, developing a management plan, and putting that plan into action. But we understand that it's easier to talk about these things than to do them. Organizing a stockpile of hazardous waste and managing the hazardous waste from community households are not easy tasks. All the photographs you've seen in these videos were taken in the NWT, so we understand the scale of the challenge faced by many community governments. But by rising to this challenge and working hard to handle hazardous waste properly, you can make a huge difference to your environment and the health of people in your community. Remember to ask for help if you need it. The GNWT is here to help you with advice and resources. Please contact the hazardous waste specialist at Environment and Natural Resources for more information. Thanks for watching and good luck.